Pull up a chair. You and I know high country winter doesn't care if you're lonely, and it surely doesn't care about love. It just kills you if you ain't ready. Old Gideon wasn't seeking romance. He just needed someone to boil his beans, scrub the floorboards, and keep that cabin fire roaring while he ran his traps. Pure survival. Bored for labor, but when he dragged a half-starved Polish immigrant out of a muddy boomtown alley, he got way more than a simple housekeeper. That frontiersman bought his very own reckoning. That Wild West boomtown of Obo was nothing but a festering wound on the mountainside, a wretched camp where desperate prospectors clawed for silver and left their decency in the muck. Gideon despised the place. He hated the foul stench of unwashed bodies, the sour reek of cheap whiskey, and those desperate, hollow-eyed glares from fools who gambled their whole lives and lost. He spat a thick stream of dark tobacco juice right into the muddy main thoroughfare. He pulled the collar of his heavy oilskin coat tight against that biting October wind. Winter was rolling in fast. He could smell it. The air held a sharp, metallic bite. It meant deep snows were gathering behind the peaks, ready to bury that frontier valley for 6 long months. He had to leave before the first killing freeze hit. Gideon kicked the thick mud off his boots against the boardwalk and shoved into Morgan's Mercantile. Inside, the air hung heavy with the rich scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and burning kerosene. Morgan, a balding shopkeeper with ink-stained fingers, glanced up from his ledger. "Gideon didn't think I'd see you down the mountain again this year." "Need 50 pounds of flour, 10 of salt, 5 of coffee, and whatever cast lead you have," Gideon grumbled, his voice grinding like a rusted iron hinge, coarse from pure disuse. He never talked to folks unless cold, hard cash was changing hands. Morgan nodded, writing, "Heavy winter coming. The local tribes say the caterpillars are mostly black this year. You're packing thick." "I need a housekeeper," Gideon barked out abruptly. Morgan stopped writing cold. The shopkeeper stared, taking in Gideon's tangled gray beard, the brutal scars across his knuckles, and the dead, flat slate of his eyes. "A housekeeper up on the ridge." "I ain't looking for a wife, Morgan. I'm looking for hands. Someone to haul well water, keep the hearth alive, while I walk my trap lines and stitch up whatever gets torn. I lost 3 toes to black frostbite last year coming home to a dead stove too bone-tired to chop kindling. I sure ain't doing it again. Room and board for hard labor." Morgan sighed deeply, wiping his hands on his apron. "There ain't a single woman in Obo who'd climb that frozen rock pile just for beans. The ladies here are hunting rich silver barons, or they're working the rowdy saloons. There's always someone desperate." Gideon grunted. It wasn't a judgment. You and I know that's just a harsh frontier fact. Morgan chewed his lip. "Check the immigrant camp behind the livery. Lots came out west chasing railroad promises that just dried up. Typhoid fever took half of them last month. The rest are out there starving to death, real slow. Mostly Poles, maybe some Germans. You might find someone hungry enough." Gideon dropped his supply list on the counter and walked right out. That muddy alley behind the livery was absolutely wretched. Flimsy lean-tos, built from scrap canvas and rotting pine boards, huddled together against the biting wind. The muck was a nasty mix of horse manure and pure human misery. Gideon marched right through it with heavy, deliberate strides. He spotted her behind a rigged washboard. Her thin arms plunged elbow-deep into a water barrel where a crust of ice was already forming. She was scrubbing a heavy wool shirt. Now she wasn't some frontier beauty. The rugged pioneer life had beaten all the softness out of her. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp enough to cast deep shadows, skin raw and chapped from the biting cold. Her dirty, pale blonde hair was pulled back tight beneath a ragged old wool cap. But Gideon didn't care about her looks. He noticed her rhythm. Up, down, scrub, ring. Absolutely relentless. Even shivering, even with her lips turning a freezing blue, that steady rhythm never broke. Just then, a drunk miner stumbled out the back door of the saloon, right next to the livery. He unbuttoned his trousers to relieve himself. spotted the girl, and flashed a leering, gap-toothed grin. He staggered her way, reaching out one filthy, grubby hand to snatch the collar of her thin dress. Gideon stopped cold. He didn't intervene. He just watched. That girl didn't scream. She didn't even shrink back. She just yanked that heavy, sodden wool shirt out of the freezing barrel and swung it like a solid club. The wet fabric caught the side of that miner's head with a mighty, sickening smack. He hit the mud, knocked out cold. The girl didn't even spare him a single glance. She tossed the shirt back into the icy barrel and resumed her rhythm. Up, down, scrub, ring. Gideon finally stepped forward. "You speak English." She froze. She looked up at the old trapper. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, exactly like the winter sky right before a blizzard hits. You and I know that look. Cautious, totally devoid of hope, but sharp. She wiped her wet hand on her apron, giving one short nod. I live 2 days' ride up the rugged mountain. It's brutal cold. It's hard. I need a woman to keep the cabin. Chop kindling, cook the food, mend the clothes. In trade, you get a roof. You get a fire. 3 meals a day, and I won't lay a hand on you. Gideon didn't soften that gravelly voice of his. He didn't aim for kindness. Out in this territory, kindness was just a fool's lie. She stared right at his massive frame, the heavy 6-shooter on his hip, that stone-cold face. Then she looked down at the mud, the freezing puddle, and the drunk, bleeding out right into the dirt. "Food?" she asked him. Her voice was raw, heavy, with an Eastern European drawl. "Bacon, beans, biscuits, deer meat when I bag one." She didn't flinch, never even asked his name. She just marched to a canvas tent and stepped right back out, clutching one beaten-up carpet bag tied with twine. That was it. Every earthly thing she owned. "I'm Karolina," she said, stopping squarely in front of him. "Gideon." He turned on his heel. "Keep up." Let me tell you, that mountain trek was brutal. The trail out of Obo started as a logging road, but quickly wasted away into a narrow, treacherous goat path. It wound deep, deep through thick lodgepole pines before spitting them out onto the bare, jagged granite of the high country. Gideon rode his roan gelding, trailing a stubborn pack mule loaded down with all their winter grub. Karolina rode a sway-backed mare he bought off a liveryman for $5. That horse was slow and mean, but Karolina never uttered a peep. 2 full days they barely spoke a word. The silence wasn't awkward, it was just plain necessary. The higher they climbed, the thinner that mountain air got. Every breath went toward keeping moving. The temperature just plummeted with every 100 feet they gained. By the first afternoon, an angry wind was howling straight through those canyons, carrying the bitter sting of sharp ice. Gideon glanced back every so often. Fully expected her to be crying. He figured she'd beg to turn around. Most city folks simply couldn't stomach the crushing weight of the wild high country. It makes a person feel small, and folks hate feeling small. But Karolina just sat hunched up in that saddle-thin coat, wrapped tight. She was shivering something fierce, her knuckles pure white where she gripped those reins, but her eyes were locked dead ahead on the trail. When they made dry camp beneath a rocky overhang, Gideon sparked a small smokeless fire from dry sage and scrub pine. He tossed her a tin plate with some hardtack and a thick, tough slice of cold salt pork. She ate it like a machine, chewing that tough meat till her jaw ached, wasting absolutely nothing. Gideon dug into his pack and yanked out a heavy, cured buffalo hide, reeked of wood smoke and old blood. He tossed it across the fire. It landed right at her boots. "Wrap up," he ordered. "I ain't burying you on the trail. Digging graves wastes good daylight." She offered no thanks, just pulled that heavy hide tight over her shoulders, burrowed into its deep warmth, and shut her eyes. Gideon studied her through the firelight. This woman was a survivor. Like a stray hound kicked one too many times, she knew exactly when to take cover and when to keep her mouth shut. You and I have seen pretty homesteads, but this cabin they reached wasn't one of them. It was a brutal, ugly shack made of rough-hewn pine logs, packed tight with mud and horsehair chinking. The roof was thick sod and heavy planks, built to handle 6 feet of winter snow. Had just 2 small, heavily shuttered windows. It sat in a lonely clearing choked by dark, imposing pines, utterly isolated. The nearest living soul was 60 miles away. Gideon swung down from his saddle. "This is it." Karolina climbs down slow, her legs stiff as boards from the freezing ride. She just stared at the cabin. She looked out at that terrifying stretch of frontier wilderness, miles of dark green and gray rolling under a heavy, bruised winter sky. Gideon unlatched that heavy timber door and shoved it open. The dead air inside smelled purely of cold ash, dried hides, and old grease. The one room was maybe 20 by 20 feet. A big cast-iron stove anchored the dead center. Had a rough table, 2 chairs, a bunk built into the wall, and a ladder going up to a storage loft. It was mighty grim, pitch black inside, just a sturdy timber box to trap the heat and keep death at bay. Karolina stepped in. No tears, not even a sigh. She dropped her bag by the door, walked straight over to that iron stove and checked the ash pan. Then she turned around, found a crude broom made of pine branches leaning on the wall, and started sweeping dirt and mouse droppings off the boards. Gideon just stood watching. A strange, forgotten feeling flared up in the man's chest. Sure wasn't affection. It was pure relief. "I'll stable the stock," he grumbled. "There's wood kindling in that bucket. Get a fire blazing." You see, that night they drew the quiet lines that defined their survival. Gideon claimed the loft. Now listen close. He pitched a canvas mattress and 2 wool blankets by the stove for her. Warmest spot in that pioneer cabin, despite those rough, unforgiving floorboards. Lying there in the pitch black, that wicked prairie wind started howling right around the cabin's corners. Terrifying noise, like a beast trying to tear the roof clean off. Gideon lay up in that loft just listening. He heard blankets rustle down below, heard her breathe. "It holds," Gideon told the dark. His voice felt mighty loud inside that small space beneath the roof. "Holds against the gale." A heavy silence followed. From the black down below, her raspy voice answered, "I am not afraid of wind." Winter hit not with a quiet whisper, but a violent, suffocating roar. Exactly 2 weeks after Karolina first swept that dusty cabin floor, the sky bruised over like cold iron. The mercury plunged 20 degrees in 1 hour, and then the snow came. No gentle flurries either. It dumped heavy, wet, blinding white sheets that swallowed the tree line and completely buried their clearing. Come morning, 3 feet of snow choked the door, still falling hard. Gideon woke up to clanking iron. He rolled over up top and peeked down. Karolina was already wide awake. The roaring wood stove cast a warm orange glow straight across the cabin. She sat grinding coffee beans in a little hand mill, her motions mighty steady and practiced. Picture this. The snow changed everything. They were trapped now. No walking out, no riding into town for a quick break. That 20 by 20 box became their whole world. At first, her cooking was downright terrible. She didn't understand Western frontier rations at all. Oversalted the beans, torched the bacon. Gideon just ate in silence, jaw muscles working hard, flat out refusing to complain. He hired a housekeeper, not a chef. But she was mighty observant. She studied how mountain altitude messed with the flour. She tasted that salt pork right before boiling it. Before a month passed, the burnt grub stopped. She started baking this heavy, ugly flatbread. Looked terrible, but it sat in your gut like a warm stone, keeping a working man fueled for hours. She rendered down that deer fat Gideon hauled in, and fried up potatoes till they were crackling crisp. Talk between them stayed mighty scarce, just the bare bones. "Wood is low," she'd say. "I'll chop," he'd answer. But slowly, a quiet sort of understanding sprouted from their daily chores. Gideon noticed his heavy canvas work coat, the one snagged on a rough branch sitting on his chair one morning, patched up perfect. Those stitches were tiny, careful, and tougher than the canvas itself. He never said a word of thanks. But that sundown, when he hauled in the day's firewood, he dropped 3 extra bone-dry birch logs right next to her bedroll by the stove. She noticed. Didn't say thanks, neither, but come sunup, his coffee was brewed exactly right, boiled pitch black with 1 drop of cold water, just to settle the muddy grounds. That mountain silence was absolute, pressing hard against those timber walls. The kind of dead quiet that drives pioneers crazy, making folks hear echoes of their own pasts. And old Gideon had ghosts, carried a heavy limp from a Nevada silver mine cave-in, flared up wicked bad whenever the weather turned sour, a throbbing reminder of men screaming in the dark. He didn't know Karolina's ghosts, but he knew she had them. Sometimes, staring into those flames, her eyes glassed right over. Her breathing would turn shallow, racing like a spooked horse. She'd hug her arms tight, rocking just barely. Gideon never once interrupted her spells. He just made certain that fire burned hot. Now the real test hit, come mid-December. Old Gideon was miles off, running a line of beaver traps down some frozen creek bed. Sky was crystal clear, but the frontier air was so blasted cold, it burned the inside of a man's lungs. Back at the homestead, Karolina was hauling a snow bucket to melt down for wash water. She pulled open that heavy wood door, propping it open with 1 boot. Stick with me here. This is where it gets rough. A coyote slinked into the cabin's lean-to. Mangy, starving critter driven plumb crazy by the winter. It caught the rich scent of salted venison hanging right from the rafters. Karolina heard those jagged claws scuffling on the frozen dirt. She stepped right out of that doorway, gripping her empty tin bucket tight. That coyote jumped up, ripping a hunk of meat from a low-hanging quarter. It hit the icy ground, chewing like mad. Then, it spotted her. Didn't even try to run. Starvation had wiped out every ounce of natural fear. It lowered its ugly head, bared nasty yellow teeth, and let loose a rattling growl. Karolina froze solid. No firearm on her. Gideon had the rifle. She had a hunting knife sitting inside on the table, but that wild dog stood right between her and the door. The beast lunged. She didn't holler. Survival instincts forged on diseased ships and filthy boomtown streets just took the reins. She swung that heavy tin bucket with both hands, cracking that coyote square on the snout. The varmint yelped, stumbling back, but it recovered in a flash. It snapped viciously at her thick wool skirt, tearing the fabric. Karolina dropped the bucket. "Gather round, friend." She snatched the first thing her fingers found, a heavy, iron-headed ash shovel propped against the cabin logs. That prairie wolf lunged again, snapping for her thigh. Karolina swung that shovel like a woodsman's axe, burying the iron edge right into the beast's neck. It collapsed into a thrashing heap of mangy fur and hot blood across the snow. The pioneer woman didn't hesitate. She brought the shovel's flat side crashing down on its skull, once, twice, 3 times, until the brute lay still. She stood there, gasping the bitter frontier frost burning deep in her throat. She stared down at the dead critter, watching crimson blood stain the fresh snow and the ragged hem of her skirt. Gideon crested the ridge an hour later. Spotting blood 50 yards out, his heart cold and steady for a decade, seized up like a rusted gear. He dropped his traps, drew his heavy 6-shooter, and ran, completely ignoring his bad knee screaming in pain. He tore into the clearing. Karolina. She was sitting calm on a stump by the lean-to. Pressing a snow-packed rag against a shallow wrist scrape, she sat there. The dead coyote was dragged off, and that dropped venison was hung right back on its meat hook. Gideon slowly lowered his 6-shooter, eyeing the dead predator. He checked the bloodied shovel, then studied the girl. She looked back, face pale, but her gaze steady as stone. "It tried to eat the meat," she stated flatly. Gideon stared. That wasn't just a hired hand anymore. He didn't see a weak immigrant from muddy shores. He saw iron. A woman who belonged to these rugged mountains as much as him. Stepping closer, he pulled off his heavy leather work glove and gently peeled the icy rag back from her wrist to check the damage. It wasn't deep. "It is okay," she whispered. her accent thick. Gideon released her hand, staring into those pale blue eyes. "Yeah," he murmured softly. "It is." January brought an absolute cold pressing against the homestead logs like a physical weight. Those cabin timbers groaned and popped at midnight, the very sap freezing solid inside the wood grain. They found a quiet, steady survival rhythm. Gideon hunted and trapped. Karolina cooked, mended, and kept the fire blazing. You and I know the wild ain't fair. A rusted beaver trap quickly changed their deal's terms. Gideon was working a frozen creek 3 miles downridge. That old trap spring was mighty stiff with winter frost. Setting the pan, his thumb slipped. Iron jaws snapped shut, biting deep into his left forearm's meat. It missed the bone but shredded right through his thick canvas duster, sinking ugly teeth deep into his arm muscle. He pried it open, wrapping the wound tight with a dirty strip torn from his flannel undershirt, and finished his trapline. Mountain men don't quit over cuts. 3 days later, it stopped bleeding. 2 days after the edges turned an angry, bruised purple. Come week's end, a nasty red streak marched up his inner arm veins, heading straight for his shoulder. Karolina was the first to notice. Serving up fried elk and potatoes, she watched him reach for his tin coffee cup. His hand shook, a violent, wild tremor he couldn't hide. He missed knocking the cup over. Dark coffee pooled across the rough table planks. Gideon stared bewildered. Sweat beaded his forehead despite the drafty cabin air. Taking a slow, ragged breath, he gripped the table edge to stand, but his legs simply gave out beneath him. He hit the floorboards like a felled pine. "Gideon." Karolina dropped the iron skillet. It hit the stove. She knelt. His skin was burning. The unnatural heat coming off him felt like a dying furnace. Rolling him over, she found his eyes half open, clouded and unseeing. He grunted something rough, spilling frantic, panicked words in a wild rhythm. "The beam!" He choked, thick hands clawing his shirt collar. "Hold the main beam. It's coming down." God, the dark. It's coming down. Now Karolina knew nothing about that collapsed Nevada silver mine. She didn't know he'd spent 3 weeks buried alive alongside his crushed crew. She only knew he was dying. Hooking him under the armpits, she gripped tight. He outweighed her by 100 pounds. She braced her boots against the floorboards and yanked hard. It was a brutal inch-by-inch drag. Her breath rasped, muscles screaming. 20 solid minutes passed, just dragging him from the table to the built-in bed across the room. Unable to hoist him up, she piled every blanket and cured animal hide around him on the floor. Stripping his heavy coat, she rolled back his flannel sleeve. The swollen bite leaked a foul yellow fluid. The skin around it felt terribly hot and tight. Infection. Back home, a nasty wound like this meant the saw. Up here, infection meant certain death. Karolina rushed to the stove. She fed the fire until that old iron stove glowed a furious cherry red. Then she sloshed water into a tin basin, setting it to a rolling boil. Popping open Gideon's heavy wooden footlocker, she dug out a straight razor, a whetstone, and half a bottle of harsh grain whiskey he kept for cleaning his revolvers. She stepped back over. Gideon was thrashing, hard wrestling with invisible frontier ghosts in the dark. "No!" he hollered, his voice breaking. "Leave me! Take the air hose!" Karolina just knelt right beside him. She pinned his left arm under her knees, throwing her entire body weight down to keep that rotting, infected limb perfectly still. Pulling the whiskey cork with her teeth, she dumped that burning liquor straight into the open gash. Gideon let out a scream. It was a wild animal roar that shattered the dead silence of the winter cabin. His back arched off the floorboards, right hand blindly clawing Karolina's thigh, hard enough to leave black and blue bruises. She never flinched. No sweet talk either. She just took that straight razor, cooked it over a candle flame until the steel went black, and drove the blade right into the swollen flesh. She carved deep, busting that pocket of poison wide open. Foul black blood welled right up. She squeezed that wound with brutal frontier efficiency, milking the deadly infection out until only pure, bright red blood ran free. She scrubbed it out with boiling hot water, dumped the last of the grain whiskey inside, and tied it up tight using clean strips ripped from a cotton flour sack. For 3 agonizing days, a fever waged war on Gideon's massive frame. Picture this. The entire power dynamic flipped upside down. The rugged protector became utterly dependent. The hired girl became the absolute master of their survival. Karolina refused to sleep. She took on chopping the timber, taking 3 times as long as Gideon ever did. That heavy axe chewed her palms into bloody blisters, the bitter frostbite biting right through her thin gloves. But she kept that woodpile high. She boiled down pure mountain snow. She shoved lukewarm broth down Gideon's throat, 1 agonizing spoonful at a time. When he fought her, she wrestled him back down. When the chills struck so hard his teeth rattled, she climbed right under that heavy buffalo hide beside him, pressing her body flush against his, sharing her core heat to cheat the freeze. Understand, there was no pioneer romance here. It was just the desperate animal instinct of shared warmth. Come the 4th morning, the blizzard finally broke, bringing back the absolute heavy silence of the mountain. Karolina sat slumped in the chair by the hot stove, her heavy head resting against the rough log timber, eyes shut tight. Her face looked gaunt, painted in black soot and pure exhaustion. Down on the floorboards, a rough, gravelly voice finally shattered the quiet. "You burned the coffee." Karolina slowly blinked her eyes open. Gideon was staring back. His eyes were sharp again. That awful glassy fever sheen had broken. He looked completely drained, aged well past his years, hollowed out, but entirely lucid. She offered no smile, no tears of joy either. She just stood up, stiff joints popping loudly, stepped over to the stove, and yanked the blackened tin pot off the iron. "You did not chop wood," she replied, voice dead flat. "I had to do it all. The axe is too heavy. I had 0 time to watch the pot." Gideon just glanced down at his bandaged arm. The cloth was stained dark, but the ugly red poison lines crawling up his bicep had faded to a dull pink. Then he noticed the massive stack of split firewood by the heavy door. He took in the deep, dark bags dragging under Karolina's eyes, and those bloody rags tied around her badly blistered palms. He swallowed hard. His dry throat felt like rough grit. "I reckon," Gideon muttered quietly. "You kept the roof from caving in." Out in this wild country, that was the closest thing to a thank you he'd ever speak. Karolina simply poured him a tin cup of water, shoved it into his hand, and dropped back into her chair. "Drink. Tomorrow you teach me to hone that axe. It is dull." Let me tell you, healing was a slow, humbling misery for a mountain man who relied entirely on brute strength for 40 years. For the next 2 long weeks, Gideon was dead stuck inside that cabin. He could barely cross the floorboards without losing his wind. Being locked in together forced a strange new frontier intimacy between the two. Before the sickness, their paths rarely crossed. He worked the outdoors. She ran the hearth. Now they were penned up in 20 square feet of space together, 24 hours a day. Gideon sat at the rough table, whittling a hunk of soft pine just to pass the weary hours. Karolina sat warming by the stove, stitching a tear in his thick wool trousers. The quiet between them felt entirely different now. It wasn't that heavy guarded silence of 2 wild strangers constantly sizing each other up anymore. You know the feeling. It was the easy, breathing silence of 2 folks who had stared down an open grave together and simply walked away. Gideon quietly watched her hands work. They were raw, heavily calloused knuckles, swollen red from freezing water and back-breaking mountain labor. Those were no longer the hands of a soft city woman. They were the true hands of a survivor. "The ship," Gideon spoke up suddenly. Karolina froze her needle. She never even looked up. "Morgan told me you came over on a big boat, chasing railroad promises." "Pull up a chair." Gideon set his blade down. "Who'd you leave behind?" Karolina just stared at that wool. She shoved that iron needle through the heavy cloth, yanking the thread tight. "No one." "Everyone leaves somebody." I didn't. She tied off the stitch and snapped the thread clean with her teeth. Finally, she met his gaze. Those pale blue eyes were dead flat. Not a drop of self-pity. My pa died coughing back in Cov. Ma took the cholera on the crossing. We wrapped her in canvas, tied iron weights to her feet, and over the rail she went into the deep water. My brother made it as far as New York, headed to Pennsylvania to dig coal. The whole mountain caved in. He never came out. Gideon felt a cold, hard fist twist right in his belly. The mine collapsed. So, she said, folding up those trousers nice and neat, I left nobody behind. They left me. She stood, walked right over, and dropped those patched pants on his table. She wasn't fishing for a lick of pity, just laying out the raw arithmetic of her days. A heavy ledger of loss. Gideon saw the pure iron spine hiding under that ragged dress. He was looking right at a mirror of his own lonely life. He reached down and grabbed a leather scabbard he had fetched from the loft days ago. He undid the leather ties and slipped out a Winchester 1873 lever-action carbine. Now that was a mighty fine piece of machinery, blued steel catching the lantern glow. Karolina stepped back, eyeing that iron warily. Sit down, Gideon ordered. She paused, then sank right back into her chair. Gideon stood up, moving real steady-like, and walked over, holding out the rifle. Take it. She grabbed it like it might bite. Heavy thing. Put the stock to your shoulder. Sight down the barrel. Karolina hoisted that gun up. She tucked the wood snug against her right shoulder. Gideon stepped right in behind her. He kept his hands to himself, but leaned in close. She caught his scent. A rugged mix of pine pitch, lye soap, and worn-out leather. It wasn't a bad smell at all. Kept a person grounded. Your arm's too short, Gideon muttered, his deep voice vibrating like distant thunder. You're stretching just to reach the lever. If you need to shoot fast, that kick will shatter your collarbone. You'd never get the next round cycled in time. He reached right out and plucked the rifle from her grip. He walked back to his table, fished out a small handsaw from his tool chest, and clamped that fine Winchester stock straight to the edge. Without a single word spoken, he started to saw. Karolina just stared, plain shocked. You're ruining it. That's a mighty costly gun. It ain't worth a dime if it doesn't fit the shooter, Gideon answered as those metal teeth tore through polished walnut. He took a full 2 inches clean off the back of that stock. He grabbed a heavy rasp, knocked down the rough edges, then screwed the steel butt plate back on, tapping it snug. He ambled over and passed it back. Try her now. Karolina lifted that iron again. This time it nestled right into the sweet spot of her shoulder. Her fingers found the lever natural as breathing. The whole balance shifted. That rifle felt like a pure extension of her own arm. Better, she finally admitted, lowering that heavy barrel. Tomorrow we head out behind the lean-to. We shoot stumps, Gideon grunted, tramping back to his seat. Coyotes are one thing. Come the spring thaw, hungry bears wake up lean and mean. And far worse things than bears roam up these trails searching for easy pickings. You and I know Western men don't talk feelings. He didn't say, I care for your safety, or I want you protected. Just, you gotta drop a target 50 yards out. He just butchered a brand new rifle stock to make damn sure it fit her shoulder. Karolina ran her fingers across that filed, shortened wood. She glanced over at Gideon, who went right back to whittling his chunk of pine like absolutely nothing had happened. A strange, deep warmth started blooming right dead center in her chest, melting away a solid block of ice that had been frozen there ever since that canvas bundle sank into the Atlantic. Thank you, Gideon, she whispered. Gideon never lifted his eyes. Just grunted, peeling a long strip of pine away with his hunting knife, but the tight knot in his shoulders dropped. For the first time in 10 long years, that old cabin actually felt like a real home. March rolled in with a liar's promise of spring. The days stretched out, and the sun glared off that snowpack with a blinding, vicious bite. Come daylight, the top crust of that snow would melt, But come nightfall, freezing temperatures locked it down solid, laying a thick, deadly sheet of ice across the whole mountain. Truly a dangerous season. Game was mighty scarce hiding out from those icy winds, and desperate drifters wintering down in the lower camps started roaming, driven half crazy by cabin fever and aching empty bellies. Old Gideon was out back busting up firewood. His muscle was back, though a dull ache still gnawed at his arm where the scars pulled tight. I'll tell you this, they were surviving. Karolina was inside, boiling down dried apples and cinnamon she'd scraped from a forgotten provisions barrel. Listen closely now. That sweet, spicy chimney smoke is exactly what lured the hungry drifter in. Gideon never heard the outlaw coming. A hard snow crust muffled those boots, while the bitter wind rattling through the bare winter aspens easily covered up the rest of the noise. His only real warning was the sudden dead silence of the mountain jays. Gideon froze mid-swing. He rested his heavy splitting maul squarely on the chopping block, just listening to the wind. The frontier woods felt far too quiet. Dropping the wood, he slipped silently toward the cabin corner, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy six-shooter on his hip. A stranger stood right at the front door. He was bundled in filthy furs and a stolen cavalry greatcoat. The man's face was nothing but greasy hair and frostbitten, peeling skin. Those eyes were wide open, darting, completely feverish. He held a rusted, single-action Colt revolver loose in his right hand. He never knocked. Instead, he booted that heavy timber door. Barred from the inside, it rattled hard against the frame, but held steady. "Open up!" The drifter screamed, his voice cracking with pure prairie madness. "I smell the grub. Open this damn door before I burn this wooden box straight down." Inside the homestead, Karolina froze solid. She quietly set her wooden spoon down. She didn't panic or holler for Gideon. Moving with a practiced, terrifying silence, she slipped over to the dark corner of the room, grabbed the modified Winchester rifle, and racked a heavy round into the chamber with a sharp clack. "I know you're hiding in there," the outlaw hollered, kicking again. "I'll blast this lock right off." Gideon finally stepped around the cabin corner. "You touch that door one more time, you lose a leg." The stranger spun around, raising that rusty Colt. He saw Gideon standing there, a massive silhouette against the snow, his iron drawn and dead steady. The drifter let out a wet, hacking laugh. "Just you out here, big mountain man. Drop the iron, friend. I just want some grub and a warm bed. Maybe your cook can keep me warm, too." Hearing that, Gideon's eyes went completely cold. A dark, absolute frontier fury washed over him. This wasn't just a homesteader defending his patch of land. It was the primal, violent rage of a Western survivor protecting his own. "You're trespassing!" Gideon growled, his deep voice, sounding like two boulders grinding together. "Turn around. Walk back down the trail." "I ain't walking nowhere. I'm taking what's inside." The drifter snarled, his dirty finger turning white on that trigger. Let me tell you, before either could shoot, that cabin door swung wide. The drifter turned his pistol, wavering in the freezing air. Karolina stood tall in the doorway, not cowering one bit. She had that Winchester raised high, the shortened stock tucked flawlessly against her shoulder. Her cheek rested on the wood, pale blue eyes locked right down those iron sights, the long barrel aimed dead center at the outlaw's chest. "Drop it," Karolina firmly commanded. Her accent was thick, her tone flat and steady. The drifter stared back, totally stunned to see this gaunt, fierce pioneer woman wielding a heavy rifle with a veteran soldier's ease. He hesitated, his starving, frozen mind totally clouded by desperation. He glanced back at Gideon, then over at Karolina. He made a fatal Western mistake. He figured she wouldn't pull the trigger. He jerked the Colt her way. Two quick shots erupted at the exact same time, shattering the quiet. Wild, echoing off those snowy granite peaks like roaring thunder. The outlaw flew backward off that wooden porch, hitting the crusted winter snow flat on his back. Gideon just stood there, six-shooter smoking hot. Karolina remained in the doorway, the lever of her Winchester already half-racked to chamber another heavy lead round. They both stared at the dead body. A dark red stain began spreading fast across the untouched white snow under the stranger's chest. Slowly lowering his smoking gun, Gideon stared down at the dead man. Then he glanced up at Karolina. She lowered the rifle, steady as a rock. Looking at the lifeless outlaw, she finally met Gideon's tough gaze. "I had him," she plainly stated. Gideon stepped over to the corpse, kicking the rusted iron far out of reach, though the poor fool was already gone. Gideon looked back at the wooden doorway. Karolina was still standing right there, holding the rifle, casually framed by the cabin's dark timber. Right then, Gideon realized a profound, terrifying frontier truth. This brutal winter was fading. The snow would soon melt, and her contracted board for labor would officially end. But looking at the chimney soot on her cheek, the fierce, untamed fire in her eyes, and the way she stood, fully prepared to kill, to defend their homestead, he knew he'd never let her walk down that mountain trail. She wasn't some hired housekeeper anymore. She was his partner. She was the only living thing that made the crushing, lonely silence of the high country bearable. "I know you did," Gideon softly replied. He slipped his gun into the leather holster and walked up those snowy steps toward her. "Let's get inside. The apples are burning up." He slowly stepped past her into the cabin. "Now, you and I know how the Wild West works." Karolina lingered briefly, watching that deadly, beautiful, frozen wilderness. Then she pulled the heavy timber door shut, bolting it tight, locking the harsh world out, and locking herself in with him. Up here, April doesn't just arrive, it attacks the mountain. You and I know the spring thaw ain't some gentle awakening. It's a violent, noisy unearthing. The frozen creek at the bottom of the ridge swelled up, shattering its ice dams with concussive cracks that echoed like artillery fire right through the canyons. The heavy snowpack didn't really melt so much as rot, turning from a pristine white shield into a treacherous, knee-deep gray slush that could suck the boots right off a man's feet. The air smelled of wet pine needles, exposed dirt, and the raw, damp breath of a waking wilderness. The high country was unlocking itself, and with it, the cabin. Gideon spent his days out in the lean-to, working over the stretching frames. The air inside that small timber shed was thick and heavy, reeking of raw animal fat, blood, and curing salt. He worked a dull draw knife over a beaver pelt, scraping the last clinging bits of gristle away before rubbing handfuls of coarse salt deep into the hide. Usually, this was the only time of year old Gideon felt something like satisfaction. A stack of prime winter furs meant survival on the frontier. It meant heavy silver coins in his pocket. It meant he had beaten the mountain for another year. But this year, every single scrape of that blade felt like a hammer driving a nail right into his own coffin. He paused, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm. Through the gaps in the logs, he kept his eyes on Karolina. She was out in the muddy yard, splitting the very last of the winter logs. The gaunt, hollow-eyed ghost he had dragged out of that oboe alley was gone, buried under 6 months of brutal labor and venison fat. She swung the heavy iron maul with devastating efficiency. Her tough canvas jacket was discarded on a stump. The sleeves of her flannel shirt rolled right up past her elbows. Lean, hard muscle corded along her forearms with every single swing. She never flinched when the wood split. She just kicked the halves aside, set a new log, and swung again. She was magnificent. She was absolutely terrifying. She was a woman entirely forged by the wild frontier, and their contract was up. Room and board for labor through the winter. That was the transaction. Now let me tell you, winter was dead. That evening, the temperature dropped just enough to harden the mud in the clearing. They sat on the small wooden porch under the deep overhang of the sod roof. The sky was a bruised, dark purple, bleeding out the last of the fading daylight. The only sound was the distant, relentless roar of the spring runoff water tearing through the valley far below. Old Gideon sat on an overturned crate. He held his heavy hunting knife in his right hand and a small, oiled whetstone in his left. He dragged the steel across the stone. The rhythm was steady and mechanical. He kept his eyes fixed on the blade, having not looked at her directly since supper. "The pass is clear," Gideon said. His voice was gravel dry and rough. Karolina sat in the wooden rocking chair he had built years ago. She had a piece of harness leather in her lap, rubbing neat's foot oil into the stiff hide to soften it up for the mules. She didn't stop rubbing. She didn't look up. "It is mud," she replied quietly. "It's possible," Gideon corrected her. "The mules will sink, but they won't break a leg. We load the furs tomorrow. We leave the day after." The knife scraped the stone again. Karolina's thumb pressed hard into the leather. "I will pack the dried meat. We need to check the rigging on the pack saddles. The canvas is frayed on the left side." Hearing this, Gideon stopped the knife. He wiped the steel clean on his thigh, sheathed it, and set the whetstone down. He reached deep into the inside pocket of his heavy oilskin coat. His thick fingers closed around a heavy, tightly drawn leather pouch. It weighed roughly 2 pounds. To him, it felt like holding a live grenade. He pulled it out and tossed it onto the small wooden table between them. It hit the rough boards with a dull, heavy clink, the unmistakable sound of coined silver. "That is your cut," Gideon stated. He kept his rough voice entirely flat. He stripped it of any warmth, any hesitation. He made himself sound exactly like the foreman of a silver mine paying off a shift worker. "Half the money from the lower cash I sold to Morgan before the snow hit. You earned it." Karolina finally stopped moving. Her hands went perfectly still on the oiled leather. She just looked at the pouch. It sat there, fat and heavy in the dim light. "You kept the fire," Gideon continued, forcing the hard words out. "You kept me breathing when the blood poison hit my arm. I would be rotting under the floorboards if it weren't for you. That money is enough for a train ticket east. Chicago, New York, or you can go west to San Francisco. You can buy proper clothes, eat in a restaurant with real glass windows, go anywhere but Obo." Karolina just stared at the leather pouch. Her pale blue eyes caught the faint light of the stars, but she didn't reach for it. "Now picture this." She looked at it with profound, quiet disgust, as if he just slapped a dead rat right on the table. "You are paying me off," she said. It wasn't a question, but a cold accusation. "I am paying what is owed." Gideon fired right back, his voice thick as saddle leather. He finally met her eyes, desperate to make her understand. He had to make her see he was saving her. "A deal is a deal, Karolina." Winter broke. You lived. But you got no business in a mud cabin 60 miles from a real doctor or a decent meal. You got silver now. Go find yourself a real life. The quiet that followed was heavy enough to choke on. The distant river faded out, leaving nothing but their ragged breathing. Karolina just set that harness leather down on the floorboards. She stood up slow, tall and proud, casting a long, dark shadow right across that cabin porch in the fading light. She did not yell, did not cry, did not touch that silver. "A real life," she whispered back. The words rasped in her throat, dry and hollow. She stared right down at him. No anger in her eyes, just a bone-deep weariness that made old Gideon's chest ache. "I will go check the mules," she told him. She stepped off that porch, boots crunching the frozen mud, vanishing into the dark toward the lean-to. Gideon just sat there in the shadows. He stared at that leather pouch. Now you gotta understand, Gideon had survived mine cave-ins, grizzly attacks, and blizzards that buried men standing up. The man had never once been afraid of the dark. But watching her walk away, the crushing isolation of that high country pressed down on his shoulders, and he realized he was flat-out terrified. Riding down that mountain took 3 grueling days. A miserable trek through gray mud and rotting snow. Neither of them said a single word. The easy, shared quiet of their winter cabin was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. Every single mile they dropped in elevation felt like a physical anvil pressing down on their backs. Breaking the tree line, they spotted the town of Obo in the valley below. Karolina pulled her sway-backed mare to a dead halt. That mining camp looked like a festering scar on the Green Valley. Just a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, raw lumber saloons, and smoke-belching smelters. Even from a solid mile up, she could hear those stamp mills grinding and smell the foul stench of sulfur, unwashed bodies, and cheap whiskey. Cold dread settled right in her gut. 6 months back, she was starving in one of those alleys. That town was everything she had run from. The helplessness, the degradation, the casual cruelty of desperate men. Old Gideon rode up right beside her. He saw her knuckles turning white on the reins, saw those pale, washed-out blue eyes harden into cold chips of ice. "Keep your rifle across your lap," Gideon barked. "You ain't the same girl they saw back in October. Don't you look at the dirt. Look them dead in the eye." Karolina just nodded once. She pulled that shortened Winchester from its scabbard, resting it casual across her saddle pommel. They rode into Obo, straight through a thick river of churned mud and manure. Miners, teamsters, and drifters choked the wooden boardwalks. Men stopped dead to stare as they rode by. Sure, they remembered Gideon, the giant scarred mountain man, but they had no clue who the woman beside him was. She sat tall up in that saddle, jaw set tight, holding a repeater with the casual ease of a true gunfighter. She never once shrank under their stares. She met every gaze, and one by one, those drifters looked away. They tied up outside Morgan's Mercantile. The brass bell jingled as they stepped inside. The air in there was thick with the smell of roasted coffee and stale tobacco. Old Morgan was behind the counter, weighing flour for some prospector. He looked up, wiped his dusty hands on his apron, and his jaw just dropped. "I'll be damned," Morgan breathed. "Gideon, you actually made it." Then his eyes shifted over to Karolina. He blinked hard. He was struggling to match this fierce, healthy woman with the starving immigrant girl he had sent up that mountain. "Lord above," he said. "I figured I'd be selling Gideon a shovel to bury you before November even hit." "You gonna weigh these pelts or not, Morgan?" Gideon grumbled, cutting off the pleasantries real quick. He hauled 2 massive burlap sacks right onto the counter. The heavy thud shook the floorboards under their boots. Morgan spent the next hour grading those winter furs. He was a shrewd trader, but he knew better than to ever cheat Gideon. Now picture this. He counts out the pay in heavy gold eagles and silver dollars, sliding the neat stacks across that scratched glass counter. "Prime catch, Gideon. Best I've seen all season," Morgan said, sweeping the furs back. He leaned in, looking at Karolina. "So, winter is over. What now, miss? You looking for work in town? I could surely use a steady clerk. Pay is fair. You wouldn't have to haul water up no mountain." Gideon's scarred hand just paused right over his coins. The big man did not look up, did not say a word, just waited. The air in that mercantile suddenly got real thick. Karolina looked at Morgan. She studied the dusty shelves, the jars of pickled eggs, the bolts of cheap calico cloth. Then she looked out that dirty window at the mud, the staggering drunks, and the absolute chaos they call civilization. She shifted her cold eyes to Gideon. He just stared at that counter, jaw clenched, big shoulders locked up, dead rigid beneath his battered oilskin coat. He was offering her a clean escape. No traps. "No," Karolina told him flat out. Her voice fell dead flat. Zero room to barter. "I don't work in town." Old Morgan looked mighty shocked, then just gave a shrug. "Suit yourself. Denver stage rolls out tomorrow at 8 in the morning. Buy your ticket down at the depot." "We need supplies," she said. She blew right past his warning. Stepping up to that counter, she commanded the whole damn room. 100 of flour, 20 of salt. The good coffee, not the dust. 10 of sugar, and a heavy block of sulfur matches. Morgan blinked hard, eyeing Gideon for the final say. Gideon raised his head slow. That iron stiffness in his back finally melted, and a subtle shift danced right across his dark eyes. It was a spark of something dangerously close to hope. "You heard the lady," Gideon grumbled, his gravelly voice dropping down low. "Load up the wagon. Put it on my tab." Karolina didn't crack a smile or blush once. She just grabbed her leather pouch of silver off the wood, marched out that front door, and took up guard duty by the mules. Her hand hovered right near the lever of her Winchester. She wasn't going anywhere. Now listen to me. They struck camp a mile past Obo, right where that sloppy mud finally turns into solid rock and dry pine needles. The rowdy town was just a dull rumble now, washed out by the snapping flames. But the air out there felt thick, a totally different kind of heavy tension. It was that loaded, dangerous quiet of two tough souls standing right on a cliff edge, just waiting to see who would leap first. Gideon sat picking stones from his gelding's hooves while Karolina busied herself boiling up some coffee. The firelight flickered across her face, throwing long, wild shadows around the camp. The stage leaves at 8. Gideon muttered quiet-like, keeping his eyes fixed on the horse's hoof. Karolina poured that steaming black brew straight into a tin cup. Then she settled the pot down on the coals. I know how to read a clock. You bought 100 pounds of flour today. Gideon dropped the hoof and turned square to her. That is winter rations. You're planning to stay. Karolina just grabbed the cup and walked right over to him. She handed him the brew. Her smooth fingers briefly grazed against his thick, scarred, battered hands. The cabin needs a new main roof beam, she told him, staring dead into his eyes. That old wood is bowing under the heavy sod. Come heavy snow this November, the whole thing caves in. You sure can't hoist a new timber alone with your bad arm. Takes two. Gideon just stared at her, leaving that hot coffee untouched. Karolina, I'm a broken, worn-out man. I live on a miserable rock where the wind screams 6 months a year. I got 0 manners. And absolutely no soft words. Got nothing to offer a woman except a harsh life and an early grave. You offer the truth. She fired right back, her accent getting real thick. She held her ground and stepped closer. Back in the old country, men fed me soft words. Then they just let me starve. In town, the fellas offered me silver, treating me like some stray dog in the dirt. But you handed me an axe. She pointed straight at the Winchester leaning on her saddle. You chopped down your own rifle so it fit my shoulder right. You took a crazy man's bullet for me, and you never once demanded any gratitude. You never asked for my body. Her voice dropped to a fierce, desperate whisper. You treated me like a real human being. I'm not a housekeeper, Gideon. Not anymore. Old Gideon's wide chest heaved. You and I both know how this goes. His decade-old armor finally cracked, shattering to dust under the heavy weight of those pale blue eyes. He reached his massive, scarred hand out, shaking just a bit, and locked his fingers loosely around her wrist. Not to hold her back, but to anchor his own soul. No, Gideon rasped. You ain't. He pulled her in close, and she didn't fight it one bit. She stepped right up, burying her face against that rough, pitch-stained canvas duster. Gideon wrapped his arms tight, holding her fierce against his broad chest. Closing his eyes, he buried his weathered face in her blonde hair, breathing in that smell of sweet wood smoke and lye soap. This wasn't some fancy parlor romance built on poetry. It was an iron bond, forged in ice blood, and the brutal, hard arithmetic of pioneer survival. Just two broken, jagged shards of humanity grinding against each other out on the frontier, until they fit together absolutely perfect. Come 8 the next morning, that heavy stagecoach rattled out of Obo, rolling east back to civilization packed with folks dreaming of easy money and a soft bed. But follow me up high above that valley, on a treacherous trail going the opposite way. Gideon rode point, sitting tall on his gelding, that dark, heavy shadow finally gone. Right behind him, Karolina sat that sway-backed mare pulling a pack mule loaded down with 100 pounds of flour, salt, and coffee. She never once looked back at town. Her eyes stayed locked on those jagged peaks, that lonely, brutal, yet fiercely beautiful high country. They were finally riding on home. You and I know, Gideon and Karolina's story proves true love isn't built on soft words. It is forged in the raw fire of survival. They didn't rescue each other from that peak. They broke that mountain together. If this gritty, honest tale of the old frontier struck a chord with you today, do an old storyteller a favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your favorite part, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share this video with anybody who appreciates a true, rugged story of frontier devotion. Until next time, keep those fires burning.